to Business at the Speed of Coffee, the television show about business, for business, by business. I'm Campbell, and today I have with me in the studio David Seymour, leader of the New Zealand ACT Party. Typically this show is about business and not necessarily about politics, but sometimes the two are inextricably entwined. And today, in the world that we live in, where there is so much disruption happening in the trade environment, internationally, with the war between China and the USA, Brexit and so forth, and here at home with poor confidence ratings and what may well be a slowing economy, that business-government interface is taking on a particular meaning. And particularly so now that we've had quite a lot of work done on New Zealand's productivity figures. But before we talk about productivity, let's hear a little bit about David Seymour, the man. Welcome, David.
Hey, look, thanks, Kip. Thanks for having me on.
Now, David, where did it all start for you? You weren't always a politician, were you? You're an engineer.
I'm a recovering electrical engineer, and my family background is in business. My grandfather built a company from scratch, Mackay and Whangarei. They are electrical contractors. They've evolved and reinvented themselves many times. They've done aid work in the islands, building runway lighting and small generators. They've done switchboards. They were involved in Tiwai Point, the oil refinery, all sorts of things throughout sort of New Zealand's development through the 20th century. They were often electrical contractors there. But for me, that meant that I grew up, hearing about the effective exchange rates and occasional, employment disputes, and somebody put the wrong diesel in the digger somewhere off atoll in Tuvalu, and it's fallen in the water, and it's all a disaster, and you still got to pay everyone the next Thursday. I've grown up steeped in business, and I think it's vital that we actually raise the esteem of business within the New Zealand psyche, because I think despite the good efforts of people like the Employers and Manufacturers Association and the Business Roundtable and its success of the initiative, we could do a lot more to hold business in the level of stature that it requires.
So, unlike a lot of politicians, you sort of businesses in your background, but as you went through high school, which was where?
I went to a school, Auckland Grammar.
Auckland Grammar, a very fine school. Yeah. Were you thinking about a career in business at that stage?
Oh no, and in fact, grammar, I was somehow got into the accelerate stream. And so if you were in the academic streams, A or B, you weren't allowed to do business.
Really?
No, so you're allowed to do Latin, okay. But doing business studies was seen as a little bit feeble for people in the academic streams. So, while I'm a huge defender of Auckland Grammar and admire the school for a huge range of reasons, it's a good example of how business is not held in the esteem it should be in.
So, from Auckland Grammar to university?
Yep. So I went and did a BA in philosophy.
Not engineering?
Well, I did an engineering degree too. See, I knew there'd be no girls in engineering, which is something that thankfully has been remedied, and engineering's a lot more balanced now. But what I didn't know is that the philosophy department was the only male-dominated department in the entire arts faculty. So that was an early failure in decision making. But look, I was glad that I got those two degrees, because they do balance each other out a bit.
First job?
Yep. So I worked for Ericsson. Yeah.
I believe you had some time in Canada or somewhere on the oil rigs or something, is that right?
Yep.
But somewhere along the line, you did develop some libertarian instincts. Can you tell us roughly when that started happening, and help us really understand how that underpins your approach to public policy now?
Well, I don't want to talk about myself, but I'll talk about something that I think is very relevant to kids today. When I was a teenager, I had probably a mild version of anxieties that I think a lot of kids are facing today, and that is that they want to be wealthy, they want to be prosperous. Most kids want stuff, as parents will know, but they also have some sort of social conscience. They don't like the idea that other people may not have much opportunity, but they're really worried about the environment. And you see columns written by school kids saying, I'm not going to have any children because it would be wrong to bring them into the world. It's much like the nuclear threat in the 70s, say, because they think that children will either contribute to climate change or be victims of it. So I had, and I'm really worried about the effect that this is having on kids, depression, anxiety. I had a version of that in the late 90s and early 2000s, but much milder. I wanted a Ferrari. I still do, by the way. And
you're in the wrong business.
Yeah, well, yeah, very much so. I need, or maybe in the right business, but the wrong country. If I was in a more corrupt country, I could do great. But in any case, I certainly wanted prosperity. I wanted to have an equal society. I grew up in the far north, remember, or in Whangarei at least. So I, went to a Decile 1 intermediate school. I got some perspective of that. Not everywhere is like the electorate I now represent. And also, I was quite anxious about environmental stuff. I was a member of the Kiwi Conservation Club, for instance. And what really changed for me was revelations that mostly came out of economics. So, the fact that two people can make an exchange, and if it's voluntary, they've both chosen to do it, and they've both deemed it to be mutually beneficial. But hang on, how can they both benefit? It must be a positive-sum game. They must be creating something new and beneficial to both. That just hit me, because all of a sudden, one person could become more prosperous without taking away the other. And then I thought, what's government about? Well, government is the only organisation that can legally compel you to do things you don't want to do. Why?
Pay taxes.
Yeah, well, but it can't be mutually beneficial, because if it was, you'd already be doing it.
Yeah.
So I was stunned by the prospect that actually you could have win-wins in life, and I was equally struck by the fact that government was the organisation that was always win-lose. Everything government does is at some level done by force. So that really hit me, but I was still worried about the environment. And then I recognised that where's the environment best? Well, it's places where people have property, because someone's saying, don't put that there. In the Soviet Union, they lost whole internal seas and lakes. Because that couldn't happen in New Zealand, because a whole lot of people with their batches would form a protest group and say, don't do that. Those property rights make people protect the environment. Then you look at where the pollution is. It's in the rivers, it's in the air, it's in the places that nobody owns. So, that's number one. Number two, prosperity. Wealthy countries have incredible initiatives, such as our Kakapo program, which is a real triumph that's happened over my lifetime. And then I sort of thought, well, okay, maybe this is not all so bad. If you believe in free markets, private property, and the prosperity that comes from them, then you can lift all boats and be a good environmental custodian. And in fact, if you don't do those things, then actually you'll fail at all of it. And so that's how I became a libertarian. And I think it's a relevant story for the anxieties that a lot of kids have today.
Well, I think what will be a surprise to some of our more conservative viewers, that the idea that a libertarian would be concerned about issues around poverty. And certainly if you look at business leaders now, the kind of conversations they're having are much more focused on social equality. And we've got a Prime Minister that can talk to a business audience all day about that without being laughed out of the room, which would have been the case, say, 30, 20 years ago. So the business community certainly is there. But in the end, you've got to run a business.
Yep.
And the question is, where would say ACT and perhaps a more libertarian view of public policy differ from where we are today? And for instance, we've seen the introduction of the wellness budget and the wellness index. What sort of public policy would need to fall out of that to satisfy your understanding of personal property rights and so on?
Well, I think, look, first of all, if you look at what do I perceive to be the big issues that business have, skills is just huge. And somehow we've managed to have a situation where there's 1 out of 10 adult New Zealanders on a benefit. 300,000 people on either, sickness invalids, what used to be called the DPB, now sole parent support, or what used to be called the unemployment benefit, now job seeker. And yet you've got a massive skill shortage. And that's despite the fact that we've got net immigration that is as high as it's ever been, despite the rhetoric of the incoming government. And here's the kicker. To achieve that situation, we spend $15 billion a year on education. And just to put that in perspective, there's 60,000 kids born every year. So every New Zealander has $250,000 of taxpayer money spent on them, and then a lot of private money too. So here's the question: are we getting bang for buck out of the $250,000 that we spend on every New Zealand citizen's education? I would say no. I mean, we've got to start looking at a model that empowers people as consumers and then sets up, I guess, an ecosystem or a marketplace of innovators and entrepreneurs to serve those needs. Because whenever we see something a little bit like that, when you take the I Have a Dream Foundation, they've featured in Ellen Duff's latest book, came out of the States in the 80s, set up here about 15 years ago. They give a kid a navigator who helps them work out what sort of educational services they need over a 15-year period to get them through uni. Now, it's just so obvious when you think about it that you'd have an expert consultant who was on that kid's side making sure that they got what they needed.
Idea.
Yeah, pretty much. Now that's the kind of thing that I suspect if you put the parents in charge of that money and said, right, we're giving your kid a student education account, we'll drip feed it in over time, you can't use it for certain things, otherwise the choice is yours, then I think there'd be a whole industry of education navigators.
So would you suggest setting up some competition?
Absolutely.
Some competitive tension in the education
Absolutely.
sector?
Look,
you see, right now I know from personal experience that the teachers' union is totally opposed to pay per performance. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have such poor growth in the education system.
And so I'd just let people opt out. I'd say, look, if you want to keep going to your state school, that's absolutely fine. There's many great state schools in New Zealand. But if you want to take your $12,000 a year and take it to an independent school, you can. What's interesting about that is independent schools are not part of the State Sector Act, so they're not compelled to take account of any collective agreements the Crown may have with some unions. That would create the competitive tension. And I think you'd see a wave of innovation. You'd see navigators, you'd see big schools, you'd see small schools, you'd see vocational schools, you'd see schools that we can't even imagine. But I think from the point of view of ultimately where we're going with this, business getting the skills they require, and this is going to take a generation, but the best time to start was 15 years ago, the second best time is now. That's one area where I think government's massively underperforming, and we could actually do better in terms of productivity if we actually had more of a marketplace for education and skills.
So it's a skills, that's one part of it. I'd like to circle back to this wellness index that the Minister of Finance has introduced, and World First and so on. And to his credit, he hasn't said we're going to get rid of the other measures at the same time, so it's there too. Let's assume that the wellness index is with us. What would you suggest public policy that would float out of that to make us better off across the whole range of wellness indices?
Oh, look, you can't defend it. It's indefensible. It's intellectually bankrupt, because what it really comes down to is putting a price on a whole lot of intangibles and then trying to design your life in accordance with that. So they will say, for instance, they've actually literally tried to put a price on the social capital that comes out of you being friends with your neighbour. And once they've worked out what the price of that is, they can work out whether or not they're going to fund a program that claims it's going to make people, putting on barbecues in your street or something.
Versus
No. This is the intellectual framework. This is the living standards framework. You've got 4 different types of capital. You've got environmental, financial, social, and human, and they want to try and basically optimize society like a big spreadsheet exercise. And this is how the Soviet Union was supposed to work.
How can you realistically attempt to do that? I mean,
well, that's what they.
Let's be charitable here.
Yeah.
It's a good idea for everybody to be happier.
Yep.
So how do you go about actually measuring that?
Well, that's what they're doing. So they've decided to use the price system, which tick. That's a good way of the price system. So pricing things is a really good way to measure their value.
Oh yeah.
And then they want to try to get government departments to work together on objectives to maximise these 4 capitals according to the prices that have been put on them. So they literally have put prices, and some of this has come out in parliamentary question time. They literally have priced different initiatives or different outcomes in terms of your well-being. And my argument is not that those well-being outcomes are not good outcomes. My argument is that epistemologically, or the philosophy of knowledge, that the government cannot know the values and the prices of these things with sufficient accuracy to actually achieve them. And so the government would be better to get back to saying, okay, here are some things that will help my well-being. Sort out the transport system. Just run a good transport system. We can easily measure that. How many people get transported to how many destinations at what cost with what time delay? Those are things they could get better. Do something about prison rehabilitation so that half the people that go out aren't back within 4 years. I mean, that would improve my well-being if I didn't have to pay tax and potentially get assaulted by a recidivist. That would be great. If they could just get to the stage where we don't have a two-speed education system where Maori and Pacific are learning at the same rate as the average Mexican or Moldovan or Eastern European, because that's where we're headed for, the labour productivity of former Soviet socialist republics and sort of middle-income countries in Central America. That's what the education system is delivering at the moment for Maori and Pacific. It would improve well-being if they just did that properly. But you don't need to merge all the government departments together and put them off on this quixotic quest to try and optimise everyone's lives. We just need government departments that stop failing at the things we already know they're failing at.
And I think, the productivity figures have been, almost every report that I've seen from the Productivity Commission is not a good picture for New Zealand. And I've yet to see, but even under the John Key's national government, the growth was, we'd have to admit it was largely driven by, big increase in population. The productivity numbers are flatlining.
Yeah.
I can't see anything particularly in this government's agenda either. What would you prescribe if you were actually going to do something about our productivity? You've talked about education, fair enough.
Yeah. Yep.
Anything else?
So, let's first of all just be clear about how big a problem this is, because some people will say, productivity's been flat around the world for the last 30 years or so, and that's true. It has slowed down in the last 3 decades globally, and there's lots of argument about why that is. Yeah. But so far as productivity is measured, New Zealand is in that bottom left quintile of countries that were bad 15 years ago and countries that have had low productivity growth for the last 15 years. So, other countries that were bad 15 years ago have grown faster than us. Is capitalisation mainly, is it not? Well, I think foreign investment's a huge issue, capital intensity, definitely. But can we also just say that the countries that have grown as slowly as us generally were more productive 15 years ago. So we're in the worst of all worlds. This is a real big problem. And look, first of all, you're right, capital investment is critical. We've been ranked in the bottom 5 in the OECD for ease of investment. And if you don't have capital, you can't be productive. If you look at what happened at the start of this parliamentary term, the foreign buyer restrictions, they're terrible and they're bureaucratic. And they're pointless because people, of course, will find ways around them. But I have to say the business community is highly culpable, because I sat through that select committee and every business group with 1 or 2 notable alternatives came along and said, we think we support the overall objectives of this legislation. We'd just like our particular industry to be excluded from it. Yeah, and I thought that was, we were both at that. I was appalled by that, the myopia that existed within the industry. So frankly, I think I can't help the business community if they aren't prepared to come in and say, actually, with the greatest of respect, we do think this is bad, and obviously we'd like our bit to be left out. But actually, you should be leaving everyone out of this. Yeah. So, stopping people investing in New Zealand is nuts. Education and skills we've talked about. Yeah. The taxation system, and we have one of the least competitive company tax rates in the whole world. And we spend all our time trying to set up rules to force people not to leave New Zealand and not pay tax here. Well, here's an idea. If we had a competitive tax rate, people might choose to locate here. And then you look at, income tax again. What sort of attitude are you giving to people, or are you modelling when government policy is that on your first 14 grand we'll tax you at 10.5, but if you study, do overtime, invest in a business, work harder, do all the things that theoretically we're supposed to be doing, you're rewarded by having your tax rate more than tripled. And that cuts in at 70 grand. Now, I think that is completely wrong attitudinally, and I've shown how you could have a flat tax of 17.5 a lot more easily than people think. How do you answer the critics that say, yes, but then you're going to favour
all those fat cat rich people who make all this money, and we've got all these inequality figures, which I think actually are not totally correct myself. But anyway, because the inequality story has gained a lot of traction in the last few years, in many ways misrepresented. How do you answer those critics?
Well,
with a flat tax rate.
Well, here's an analogy. I mean, the place in the world that has seen the biggest alleviation of poverty in human history is China in the last 30 years. Hundreds of millions of people come out of poverty. Now, that's a country that went from full communism, effectively 100% tax rate, to having special economic zones, many of which did have flat taxes. And you know what? The poor people in China have benefited far more in the last 30 years from free markets, productivity, economic growth, than they have benefited from the preceding 30 years of central planning and socialism. Now,
you can actually have a look at the United States. As much as everybody wants to, criticise President Trump, you could almost say that's a causal relationship. He did lower taxes dramatically, and unemployment rates plummeted. I mean, Look, and look, we're talking about the poorest people paying a 17.5% tax rate. Well, Helen Clark and Michael Cullen had a tax rate of 19.5% on your first dollar. So they're actually taxing less than they are. So look, I don't think the flat tax is a big issue. But the biggest thing in my view, I mean, so you got skills, you got foreign investment, you got tax, but you also got to think about regulation, and it's just a nightmare. I mean, I was talking to a friend, and this is not a business example, but someone who had to pay $2,000 and wait 6 weeks to get permission to put insulation in her own walls. Now, no one else is going to know. Someone's going to see it. It doesn't affect anyone else. And it's an example of a regulatory culture where all the time people are just hounded, not by a government that's trying to solve a public problem, but basically make work for bureaucrats, impose one person's views on another, or just generally be a pain in the ass. And you go through the financial sector, I mean, it's just a nightmare. We've had peer-to-peer lenders basically shut down by bad regulation. So we got, a huge number of difficulties where regulations are made without proper problem definition, without cost-benefit analysis, without identifying winners and losers, without doing any of the basic regulatory impact analysis. Would you?
Business are paying the cost for that.
Would you advocate, again, President Trump's idea that you can't bring a new regulation without getting an old one?
Having worked in Wellington, I can tell you, if you tell bureaucrats that they need to delete 2 regulations for every new one they bring in, the net effect of that policy is that the new regulations will be at least twice as long as the old ones. I mean, that's the only, it's the human outcome, Look, I mean, it would be nice if it was that simple, and it's a good thing to sell rhetorically on the hustings. I get why you did it. But you've actually got to try and change the culture by requiring bureaucrats and politicians to define the problem they're trying to solve. That would get rid of half of it.
Well, they're supposed to do regulatory impact reports, but everyone I've seen hasn't actually.
I agree. Well, that's the problem.
The planning systems themselves.
In terms of the regulatory planning or
I'm just
urban
thinking
planning?
Urban planning and local government.
That is the number one issue caused by bad regulation. I mean, fundamentally, what's happened in the last 25 years in Auckland is the price of land has gone up 900%. Because they've put a cordon around the city and said thou shalt not build beyond there. It's just supply and demand. It's an absolute disaster of bad regulation that wasn't put there to solve any particular problem. There's no cost-benefit analysis, and it's created enormous problems. And people say, well, what does that mean for business? Well, for one thing, $2 billion a year in accommodation supplements. For another thing, if you've got labour shortages, remember that the price of housing is priced into your wage bill. So, having an inefficient housing market, being great if you had the wit to invest in property 20 years ago, for everyone else it's a disaster. It's effectively a tax on productivity.
David, before we close, you have been an electoral MP for some time now. I want to congratulate you for being a very good one. Highs and lows of your electoral life?
Yeah, I think probably highs are getting to actually help people. So, doing charter schools. We change thousands of kids' lives in a really profound way, that we put them in an environment where they could achieve things and build their own self-esteem for themselves, and that was huge. Similarly, Anna Carolina Bircham lives very near to where you do, just up Air Street. She was in Starship for 5 years. Yesterday, I personally accompanied her home after a huge battle. Electorate work often doesn't get publicised because the nature of it has to be private. But electoral work, that's a real high. I think the lows are just that there's a lot of people who you can't engage. I mean, this has been a fantastic initiative, and good on you, and I hope the show goes well, because we're actually talking about public policy and how to make a better tomorrow. There's so much ad hominem, there's so many people who really, unfortunately, can't engage in the debate, so they just personally attack you, and that's a real shame.
Social media must have a lot to answer for in that sense, do you think?
Oh yeah, but look, there's people in the mainstream media who, you'd be astonished once and you will have had this experience throughout your career. Once you've been at the centre of a few stories and seen how wrongly things are reported in stories where you do know the truth, then it's impossible to ever trust the account of what's going on elsewhere. So that's a problem. I
can't finish the interview without perhaps thanking on behalf of New Zealand on the work you've done on the end-of-life legislation.
Oh, thank you.
We're still in the middle of all that. I think as a betting man we're going to get a result, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Has that been an enlightening experience for you, or a particularly difficult one? Because you're dealing with something that nobody really wants to talk about.
Yeah, look, it's been a fascinating experience because you learn so much about people. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of things I'll never talk about, but there are members of Parliament that I've spoken to, I've gone through it, I've explained that all of the international evidence is on the side of choice here. The scare stories are not true. That their electorate, the people that elected them, overwhelmingly are in favour of the legislation, and they've said to me, I'm just not going to vote for it because I'm too Catholic. Well, not all Catholics think that way, for a start, and second of all, I'll never out them for having done that, but how pathetic. Not caring about the evidence, not caring about the electors, just indulging their own beliefs. On the other hand, there are people who are voting for the bill that I know have been put through the ringer and lobbied to hell for opposing, for favouring it. And they've gone on the evidence, they've gone on the electorate, and they're supporting it anyway. So, I learn a lot about people.
Well done, but it's a sign of our times that we're seeing it with climate change, we're seeing it with deniers, all sorts of things. People who wish to be willfully ignorant, who don't want to look at the evidence, which is clearly there. And it is a worry, the anti-vaxxing, we're seeing it. We're seeing it now with this alternative food thing. And I think for our viewers, we have to invite them to actually look at the evidence, to believe in science, and to stand up for what is actually clearly and objectively the right thing to do. So David, thank you for being on Business at the Speed of Coffee. We could go on for some time because it's such an interesting conversation, and all the very best with the end-of-life bill, because I know it's a big thing to have done, and let's hope it works out for you.
Yeah, let's hope it works out for everyone. Thank you.